thank you all for coming to our panel. I'm very glad to be here. In this paper, I developed the analytical framework of my book manuscript on agri-food system change in Egypt. A main argument begins with the assertion that Egypt's heightened integration into the world economy in the 19th century and in the neoliberal period, this two periods of so-called globalization, depended on the continual reclamation of land. That is a process of making land suitable for commodity production that was previously unsuitable. Thus, continual reclamation meant the expansion of the total area of cultivatable land over time in the modern period. In the Longue durée, land reclamation has played a role in state-making, particularly in semi-arid areas with greater nomadic and pastoral populations, notably the greater Mediterranean and the western United States, among other regions. And the case of the Ottoman Empire, of which modern-day Egypt was a part, illustrates that in the transition from the early modern to the modern period, reclaimed lands became the spatial center of expanded commodity production for export to Europe. So why reclaimed lands? To address this question, I first want to distinguish land reclamation as a distinct type of commodity frontier. Reclamation involves a process of making land suitable for intensive cultivation and or settlement. Lands may have never been developed before or were not cultivated in the recent past. So for example, they may have been abandoned or had become degraded. And most importantly, reclamation involves comparatively significant levels of capitalization. Thus, dominating land reclamation as a frontier are investors, capitalized firms, local elites, and the like. Oops, wrong button. Okay, take for example the well-known large-scale land reclamation project in the early modern period, the fenlands in eastern England. Some of you may be familiar. On the left are shows the wetlands that were drained during the enclosure movement from the 17th century in England. And on the right, the approximate area of the reclaimed lands today, an area that is described as hundreds and thousands of a man-made ecosystem. This type of commodity frontier differs from the commodity frontier that Jason details in the early modern period, of places of expanded commodity production backed by territorial power with little capital. Moore's commodity frontier may require merely an axe and hoe to cut down trees and is commonly characterized by the settlement of small-scale producers. In contrast, the level of capitalization involved in land reclamation for agriculture to build irrigation infrastructure, transport routes, and so on, in effect necessitates placemaking for extensive cash crop production to bring a return on investment. So turning now to land reclamation in the modern era in Egypt, I trace three eras of frontier making via land reclamation. The main points that I want to highlight about this typology, and probably some of these aspects you want to know more about, but we can talk about property and labor later. The main points are that the two commodity frontiers are the frontier one of the early modern period, frontier one of the long 19th century, and then frontier two, the desert frontier of the neoliberal period. That is place-making for expanded commodity production. And then the second era of frontier making is what I call the state frontier or state reclamation, which was the period, the post-World War II, post-independence period. In the typology, notably, in all three frontiers, land reclamation shares a common characteristic from the early modern period of the Ottoman Empire. And here I'm going to pull up kind of a typical map of the expanding Ottoman Empire. From early on in the empire, a practice of the state was to claim land and confer rights to individuals to develop the land. This practice has been tied to policies of sedentarization, as the state would override communal or customary rights of Bedouin and other pastoral nomadic peoples, and attempt to gain allegiances among the tribes by granting the headmen rights to the land. In terms of state building, this practice became a way of building political alliances and defraying costs onto private individuals and thereby building a tax base. In the typology that I created, the first era of frontier making began in the Ottoman Empire from roughly the mid-18th century, when private estates for the production of cash crops for export to Europe began to develop on reclaimed land on plains that were with irrigation and that were easily accessible to transport routes to Europe. So these private estates were concentrated on the irrigated plains of the Balkans, southwest Anatolia, what is now Syria, and what is now Egypt. The Ottoman province of Egypt, in fact, became one of the main agro-exporting regions, irrigated plain, of the empire beginning in the first decades of the 19th century under the reign of Muhammad Ali. And here's a close-up shot of the delta under British rule. This is a British map from 1910. The delta in particular, which had gone through a process of settlement and cultivation, the delta was the center of production, largely of cotton, and production rose exponentially under British rule from the early 1880s. And here on this map, the designation of the mouths of the Nile really hints to me at the importance of the delta to the British. A key point is each wave of expanded commodity production rested on the expansion of reclaimed lands. So while the map here of the delta is a delta fixed in place, the delta has actually been expanding since the early 19th century, as the following map shows. Just as there were waves of land reclamation during the long 19th century, there was a great expansion in reclaimed land in the neoliberal period and into more arid lands, which is why I call it the desert frontier of the neoliberal period. Under both President Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, this expansion has largely been of industrial horticulture, fruits and vegetables, of animal protein, especially poultry, and food processing, both for export and for domestic market. I argue that the desert frontier enabled the growth of a formal agri-food industry or corporate agri-food system. And here are some key points of the present-day agri-food industry. As you can maybe see from the map, agribusiness is concentrated, or industrial farms, agribusiness, are concentrated in the desert frontier to the west of the delta. Another point is that frontier making via reclamation is a response to the degradation of conditions of production in existing agricultural areas. So degradation means here a combination of forces from, say, rising land prices from the creation of a land market and mortgage credit, to depletion of irrigation water sources, to genetic erosion from seed varieties, to deactivation of agricultural areas via urbanization. This is where Jason's concept of relative exhaustion is useful. Existing places of production become less profitable relative to places that would require investments to reclaim. The co-production of nature and society in this movement is imperative here, and land reclamation as a frontier provides a lens on the ecological foundations of commodity production, especially as farms have moved into arid regions in the neoliberal period. The twin forces of vulnerability and coercion have increasingly come to characterize production in the desert frontier. One last point, and then a concluding remark, returning to the typology of frontier making in the modern era in Egypt, land reclamation also develops a distinct characteristic during the last two eras of frontier making when Egypt becomes an independent nation state. So really in this moment of an international system of nation states, land reclamation becomes a way for polity and society to resolve, in Hegel's terms, the inherent tension of bourgeois society. At the end of World War II, when Egyptian society was intensely polarized between the masses of landless and the elite classes of industrial and finance capital, land reclamation begins to be offered as a policy mechanism to distribute land to the landless. And during the heightened tensions of the neoliberal period of counter-agrarian reforms, of unemployment and underemployment and so on, land reclamation begins to hold a promise of resolving a host of social and environmental problems. For example, take this dramatic proclamation of an agribusiness executive during an interview in Cairo in 2011. What happened in the desert is a miracle. It saved Egypt from starvation. The population increased by 45 million under Mubarak, doubling and more. Without the effort to reclaim land, Egypt would starve. So these kind of neo-Malthusian narratives were ever present during field research between 2008 and 2012. Okay, in conclusion, the desert frontier concept demonstrates that this spatial fix is never a fix. The interaction of capital, labor, sandy soil, the sun, the state, biosecure technologies, and so on, the neo-Malthusian narratives and so on, make capital accumulation, agriculture, and food possible, but only in a perpetual sense. And these times of an intensified tension, of growing soil salination as water levels rise in a warming planet, of revolution and counter-revolution, and on, certainly these times raise the question, is the continual expansion of the desert frontier coming to an end? And my short answer is no, not in the near future. And I'm happy to elaborate on that point in the discussion. Thank you.
Next, Sven. So shooting for 15, 20 minutes. 20 minutes is the hard stop.
Yeah, well, it won't take that long normally. All right, hello everyone. Today I'm going to present you the main results of my PhD, which I successfully defended some 3 weeks ago. As you can see, the title is somewhat different of what is announced in the abstract, but that won't be a huge problem. So this paper is called Changing Grounds, Development of Coffee Production in the Lake Kivu Region, 1980, 1960, 62. And the subtitle is The Colonial State, Labor, Land, and Production for the World Market. Now, the Kivu region, my region of focus, is to be situated in Central Africa. This map details a bit more the Kivu area. My interest in coffee production in this region actually evolved out of a quite remarkable observation. Coffee entered this area at the end of the 19th century, but it was not cultivated for the export market before World War I. After World War I, on the left side of the lake, a plantation economy emerged. As this diagram shows, in the colonial period, plantations were the main coffee production system left of Lake Kivu and in the Belgian Congo altogether. On the right side of Lake Kivu, on the other hand, we basically see the emergence of, we basically see a mirror image, because on the Rwandan side of the lake, smallholders were the main coffee producers, even though there were some plantations as well. Now, the existence of two different coffee production systems intrigued me, and I wanted to learn more about it. In particular, I wanted to know why the sector differed in such a remarkable way. By comparing both sides of the lake, I wanted to find out how the production factors, land and labor, were mobilized, and what part different actors on the ground, the colonial state, settlers, African notables, and workers themselves, played. I argue that coffee production in the Lake Kivu region developed and evolved not only as a result of existing local differences between East and West that were strengthened during the colonial period, but also as a result of compromises between and feedback of several actors involved. Despite harmonizing tendencies inherent in capitalism, these two factors, difference and compromise, resulted in two main divergent coffee production systems, with mainly plantations left and mainly smallholders left of the lake, and consequently in dissimilar ways of mobilizing and commodifying labor and land. It may be recommended to shortly summarize the coffee production process, because it's important to understand the ways land and labor, were mobilized. For starters, there was and there still is a cyclical demand for labor. So this means that there were a lot of temporary labors involved, and especially during planting or sowing and harvesting periods was the demand for labor very high, which obviously influenced labor recruitments, for example. Now, after young plants were planted or seeds were sown, it took about 4 years before berries began to grow, with a maximum yield after 6 years. But from the start on, a very careful maintenance, for example, the removal of weeds, was essential for later harvests. And during these harvest periods, which last about 3 months, many women and children were also involved in the cultivation process. Now, even though there are some differences in the way large-scale and small-scale production took place, this is broadly speaking the coffee production process. Now, that said, the first thing I will focus on is to explain why two different coffee production systems could develop in one interlinked cultural zone in the first place, and this is really at the heart of my story. Now, as I shortly said before, coffee entered the Kivu region at the end of the 19th century thanks to the efforts of missionary fathers. But until World War I, coffee production was still very limited. In the eastern Congo, a rush of colonists happened from the mid-1920s onwards, which was basically the start of the coffee plantation economy there. In Rwanda, and despite limited attempts of Germany before World War I, it was not until the early 1930s that coffee production really took off. And thus, from the early 1930s onwards, several consecutive coffee campaigns were launched by the European administration in order to introduce and develop small-scale African coffee production. So, already in the initial startup stage, differences were at stake. But why? Even though several factors had an impact on this difference, my PhD research revealed that 3 in particular stand out as prevailing parameters. The first factor is land availability, and this is quite easy to explain. Rwanda was and still is more densely populated than most regions in the eastern Congo, and hence there was a lack of land in order to install a plantation economy in Rwanda, and thus coffee had to be cultivated by African smallholders. This, in combination with a legal difference, even strengthened the existing differences. Rwanda and Burundi were, as opposed to the Belgian Congo, a Belgian mandate, which means that the UN was always lurking behind the corner. Hence, it was more difficult for colonizers to erase or even alter existing socio-economic systems in Rwanda. That does not mean that it did not happen, though. Now, the third factor was, when Belgium entered Rwanda after the First World War, the existence of a centralized, hierarchical, individualized land system perfectly suitable for the development of a smallholder system. Now, this system existed in central Rwanda, but during the Belgian period, it was implemented in other Rwandan regions, and thus this, in combination with the other factors, became the cornerstone of small-scale coffee production in Rwanda. So it is clear that there were factors that determined the development of two different coffee production systems. The development of divergent systems obviously also resulted in dissimilar ways of how land and labor were mobilized on both sides of the lake. However, as I stated in my main argument, the development was also a result of compromises between and feedback of different local actors involved. Let's first take a look at differences in the way coffee land was mobilized, and by that I mean the ways land were used to produce coffee for the world market. Even though in both the colony and the Belgian mandate a dual land tenure system emerged, which distinguished between African land and vacant land, the latter which could be used for European plantations, for example. The big difference between the two is that in the eastern Congo Kivu, a parastatal organism, the Comité National du Kivu, was responsible for the distribution of land to colonists. But such an organism was lacking in the mandate, even though there were some plantations as well. In Rwanda, on the other hand, much more emphasis was put on the individualized land tenure system, which I mentioned before. This system was exported from central Rwanda to other Rwandan regions, and it served as the basis for small-scale African coffee cultivation. Now, besides this difference, the way colonial administrations intervened differed as well. For example, at the end of the